The vibration against my palm wasn't a standard text notification. It was a rhythmic, urgent pulse that I knew better than my own heartbeat. I looked down at the sleek, black device, seeing only the biometrics flushing red. A silent scream that something critical was happening in the Eastern Hemisphere. I barely had the phone to my ear, my breath caught in my throat, when a hand shot across the dinner table like a striking cobra. It was sudden, violent, and dripping with entitlement. Rick, my mother's new boyfriend, a retired lieutenant colonel who believed he was the only authority figure in any room, snatched the device right out of my hand. He glared at me, his face twisted in that familiar mix of disappointment and rage, before shouting directly into the receiver. "Enough with the games. We are having a family dinner, and I am talking to you. You will learn some respect." He waited for an apology from whoever was on the other end, chest puffed out, ready to lecture some teenage friend of mine. Instead, the room went dead silent. The voice that leaked from the speaker wasn't a teenager's. It was calm, terrifyingly authoritative, and instantly recognizable to anyone with a television. "This is the President of the United States. Identify yourself and return this device to Admiral Vance immediately. That is a direct order." Rick froze. His face didn't just pale, it went gray, the color draining away as if a plug had been pulled. In that second, Rick realized he hadn't just taken a phone from his girlfriend's rude daughter. He had just interrupted a briefing on national security, but to understand why he felt comfortable enough to snatch that phone, you have to understand the helpless little girl narrative my mother had built around me. To understand the reckoning, we have to go back 3 months to when I first arrived for the holidays. I walked through the door, wearing an oversized university hoodie and worn-out jeans, looking every bit the aimless millennial drifting through life. The reality, however, was buried under layers of classified ink. I am a Rear Admiral, lower half, in USCYBERCOM, specifically leading Unit 8200 in threat analysis. My days are spent making decisions that keep the power grid running and the banks open. But because my work is top secret at CI to my family, I just work with computers. That ambiguity was all the ammunition Rick needed. From the moment I dropped my bags, he was on me. He was old core, a man obsessed with visible ribbons, perfectly creased trousers, and the loud projection of authority. He looked at me and saw a failure, a civilian soft body who didn't understand the price of freedom. He'd corner me in the kitchen while I was brewing coffee, quizzing me on military history like I was a fresh recruit who needed hazing. "Bet you don't even know the logistics behind Operation Desert Storm," he'd sneer, leaning against the counter with a smug grin. "Kids today, you think war is a video game." I would just stir my coffee, staring into the black liquid while mentally tallying the doctrine updates I had authored just last week, updates that cited the very logistics he was lecturing me on. I bit my tongue until it bled, letting him call me private pile and civilian, letting him believe his own superiority. I absorbed every slight, every interruption, and every condescending pat on the head, knowing that eventually the silence would have to break. The atmosphere in my mother's living room was suffocating, a chaotic whirlwind of wedding planning that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the air. The dining table was buried under mountains of fabric swatches, floral arrangements, and catering menus, all for a ceremony that was becoming less about love and more about a coronation for Rick. My mother, Janice, a woman who had spent her entire adult life shrinking herself to fit into the shadows of louder men, was fluttering around him nervously. She looked at me with those pleading eyes, the ones that begged me not to make waves, while Rick held court at the head of the table. He didn't ask me about my life, he told me about my limitations. "Now, Elena," he said, pointing a fork at me like a baton, "we need to know if you can, actually, afford a bridesmaid dress. I know money is tight for people in your line of work." He paused for a dramatic effect, looking at my mother for approval. "And honestly, can you even get the time off? I know how those help desk jobs are, always on call to reset a password for some forgotten grandmother." I sat there, gripping my coffee mug until my knuckles turned white, forcing a tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I think I can manage the dress, Rick," I said quietly. He just snorted, launching into another monologue about service, duty, and honor, recounting his glory days in the Gulf War for the 100th time. He spoke about discipline and chain of command as if he had invented the concepts, completely unaware that the woman sitting across from him was currently rewriting the rule book on modern warfare. The contrast between his delusions and my reality was so sharp it almost gave me vertigo. Just 12 hours earlier, I hadn't been sitting at a messy dining table. I had been walking through the reinforced blast doors of the National Military Command Center. The air inside the NMCC is different. It's recycled, cold, and vibrates with the low hum of servers that hold the fate of nations. When I swipe my badge there, I'm not Elena the broke daughter. I am the lead authority for Unit 80200. In that room, nobody asks if I can afford a dress. They ask if I authorize a kinetic response. While Rick was home showing my mother how to fold a napkin the army way, I was standing in front of a wall of screens, tracking a foreign adversary probing the Eastern power grid. My team was looking to me for the go-ahead on a counteroffensive against a sophisticated, zero-day exploit that threatened to plunge the entire seaboard into darkness. We were dealing with attribution thresholds that were razor-thin. One wrong move, one miscalculation on my part, and a cyber skirmish becomes World War III. I remembered the weight of the tablet in my hand as I authorized a specific defensive posture, the silence of the room as seasoned officers waited for my command. I had the power to shut down a foreign city's banking system with a keystroke, yet here I was back in my mother's kitchen, being lectured on real work by a man whose security clearance expired before the iPhone was invented. It was a duality that was becoming impossible to maintain, a splitting headache that throbbed behind my eyes. My mother must have sensed the tension radiating off me because she pulled me into the hallway later that afternoon. She gripped my arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. "Elena, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Rick is a colonel, honey. He's used to being respected. Just put the phone away and listen to his war stories. It makes him feel big." I looked at her, and I felt a profound sadness wash over me. It wasn't just about Rick. It was the internal ledger I kept, the endless tally of times I was asked to diminish myself so a man could feel tall. I saw the science fair trophies she put in the closet so my brother wouldn't feel jealous. I saw the graduate degrees she never mentioned to her friends because they sounded intimidating. She was asking me to play a role in a play I had outgrown a decade ago, to be the audience for a man whose ego was as fragile as it was inflated. "He's not a colonel anymore, Mom," I said gently, but she just shook her head, dismissing reality to keep the peace. I retreated to the guest room, my sanctuary, and checked my secure phone. That's when the call came in, not a text, but a direct line ringing through the encrypted app. It was General Iron Mike Sterling, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and my direct mentor. A man who drank his coffee black and chewed glass for breakfast. Admiral, his voice was gravel and urgency, completely devoid of the condescension I heard at home. "The grid situation is escalating. We're seeing new signatures in the malware." He didn't treat me like a child. He spoke to me as the only other person in the hemisphere who understood the threat. "I'm tracking it, General," I replied, my voice dropping an octave, shifting instantly back into command mode. "I'm monitoring the patches now." "Good," he said. "But listen to me, Elena. You need to be on tether status. If this goes red, I need you on the line within 30 seconds. No excuses. The president is watching this one personally." Tether status meant I was effectively chained to my device. It had to be. Within arm's reach, volume up, ready for a flash override at any second. It was the highest state of alert, short of active war. I hung up, staring at the black screen. Rick thought he was the ranking officer in the house because he had a shadow box full of medals on the wall. He didn't know I carried the nuclear command authority in my pocket. I didn't snatch the phone back. I didn't have to. Rick's fingers had gone numb, his grip failing as the blood rushed away from his extremities. I reached out and gently removed the device from his trembling hand, my movements fluid and practiced. I brought the phone to my ear, my voice shifting instantly from the tone of an annoyed daughter to the steel cadence of a commanding officer. "Apologies, Mr. President. Secure line compromised. Initiating Viper protocol. Switching to secondary encryption immediately." I tapped the screen, severing the connection. and the silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually follows a gunshot, ringing heavy and filled with shock. Rick stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, his brain desperately trying to reject the reality of what he had just heard. He needed it to be a lie. Because if it was true, he had just committed a federal crime. Then, the denial kicked in. He let out a laugh, a sharp, nervous bark that sounded pathetic in the quiet dining room. President? Yeah, right, he stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead and glancing at my mother for backup. Who was that really, Elena? Your boyfriend doing a prank voice? You almost had me going there for a second. Very funny. He was begging for me to crack a smile, to admit it was all a joke so he could go back to being the patriarch who knew better. But I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. The same calm I felt when I watched malware dismantle a firewall. I looked at him, not as a stepfather figure, but as a security risk. Rick, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion you just physically intercepted. A classified communication during an active national security crisis. Under Title 18 of the U.S. Code, I am legally required to report this breach as a potential insider threat. His nervous smile faltered, replaced by a flash of that familiar, bullying anger. Don't you quote laws at me, young lady. I was serving this country while you were still in diapers. You and your fake computer games. You're a liar. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to match his. I simply pulled up my calendar on the secure tablet I kept in my bag. Fine, I said, turning the screen so he could see the entry for Saturday night. If you don't believe me, you can explain it to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs yourself. You're coming with me to the gala on Saturday. It's mandatory now. You're listed as a material security witness. Rick looked at the screen. He didn't see the threat. He saw the word gala. He saw Joint Chiefs. His chest puffed out, the arrogance flooding back in as he saw an opportunity to finally expose me in front of real soldiers. Fine, he grunted, straightening his shirt. I'll be there, and I'll wear my mess dress. Someone needs to show those desk jockeys what a real soldier looks like. He polished his medals, thinking he was walking into a party to show me up. He didn't realize he was walking into a court-martial of his own ego. The Joint Chiefs Holiday Gala is not the kind of party where you crash the buffet or make small talk about the weather. It is a gathering of the most lethal and intelligent minds in the Western Hemisphere, a room where the air hums with the static of immense power. Rick strutted into the ballroom with his chest puffed out, scanning the crowd for someone of his rank to bond with, desperate to find a fellow old warhorse who would validate his existence. But the active duty generals and admirals? They looked right through him. To them he was just another retiree in an ill-fitting mess dress, a ghost from a bygone era trying to haunt the living. I had slipped away to the cloakroom the moment we arrived, leaving Rick to drown in his own irrelevance for 10 minutes. When I walked back into the ballroom, I wasn't wearing the modest cocktail dress my mother had picked out to avoid outshining anyone. I was in full dinner dress white. The pristine fabric cut a sharp silhouette against the dark suits of the crowd, but it was the sleeves that mattered, the broad, heavy gold stripes of a rear admiral catching the light of the chandeliers. Rick turned, a glass of cheap wine halfway to his mouth, and he froze. He didn't look impressed, he looked furious. His face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation, unable to process that the lazy millennial he bullied over breakfast was outranking every officer he had ever served under. He marched toward me, his voice booming over the polite chatter of the room. You actually bought that at a costume shop? He spat, his fingers shaking as he pointed at my chest. This is stolen valor, Elena. Do you have any idea the disgrace you are bringing on this family? Take that off before I have security drag you out. People turned. The low hum of conversation died instantly. I saw a few jaws drop, not at me, but at the sheer audacity of this man screaming at a flag officer. I felt a cold heat rise in my chest, not embarrassment but the fiery resolve of a final accounting. He was trying to humiliate me one last time, to put the little girl back in her box. Before I could verbally eviscerate him, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. General Iron Mike Sterling, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, stepped into the circle. Rick's training took over before his brain could catch up. He snapped to rigid attention, his heels clicking together, his eyes locked forward in terror. He expected a commendation for spotting the fake. Sterling didn't even glance at him. He turned his back on the trembling colonel and extended a hand to me. "Admiral Vance," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine respect. "The White House is still raving about your handle on the grid situation. Good to see you in uniform, Elena." Rick made a sound like a deflating tire, a wheezing gasp of confusion. But there was no time to process it. The music cut out abruptly. The announcer's voice boomed from the speakers, demanding absolute silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States." The room stiffened. The Commander-in-Chief took the stage, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's focus. He didn't start his speech. Instead, he leaned into the microphone, his gaze locking onto our little drama in the center of the room. "Before we begin," POTUS said, his voice amplified and echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "I want to spot Admiral Vance." A spotlight swung from the rafters, blindingly bright, trapping me and a sweating, shrinking Rick in a circle of illumination. I stood tall, offering a sharp salute. Rick looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. "And I believe," the president continued, a dry, dangerous amusement coloring his tone, "the gentleman next to you is the one who wanted to have a chat with me the other night? Colonel, step forward." Rick trembled. He was forced to step into the light, exposed before the entire Pentagon brass, stripped of his bluster. He looked small. He looked terrified. The president smiled, but it was cold, a smile that promised consequences. "Colonel, let me be clear. When Admiral Vance is on the line with me, she is the most powerful person in the room. She speaks with my voice. I suggest you remember that chain of command the next time you feel like lecturing a superior officer." The room erupted, not in applause, but in polite, knowing laughter. It was the sound of 1,000 professionals recognizing a fool. Rick stood there, destroyed, the weight of his arrogance finally crushing him flat. In the military, we have a term for total tactical overmatch. Rick had brought a knife to a nuclear gunfight. The drive home from the gala was the longest 45 minutes of my life, but, for the first time in decades, the silence in the car wasn't mine to carry. Usually these rides were filled with Rick's post-game analysis, a loud, droning critique of my posture, my tone, or my failure to laugh at his jokes. But tonight, the only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the ragged, hitching breath of my mother sobbing in the passenger seat. Rick sat in the back, a place he usually reserved for me, staring out the window at the passing streetlights, his reflection in the glass looking ghostly and hollow. He hadn't spoken a single word since the President of the United States had publicly dismantled. His ego and the vacuum of his authority left the car feeling strangely pressurized. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles loose and relaxed, feeling a sense of control that had nothing to do with the vehicle. I glanced at my mother, Janice, a woman who had spent years curating a museum of perfect family moments at the expense of my dignity. She wasn't crying because she was proud of me. She was crying because she was embarrassed. I could see the calculation behind her tears, the terrifying realization that she had bet her social standing on a man who had just been exposed as a fraud in front of the most powerful people in Washington. I thought about the years of forced apologies, the times she told me to be the bigger person, the endless dinners where I was silenced so Rick could feel important. I looked at her crumbling facade and realized that my victory hadn't fixed our relationship. It had simply illuminated the cracks so clearly that they could no longer be ignored. The real consequences, however, didn't arrive until 3 days later. They came in the form of a standard white government envelope, the kind with the window that reveals nothing but official business. Rick was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a coffee and pretending to read the paper, trying to reclaim some scrap of his old routine. He tore the envelope open with a trembling hand, expecting perhaps a bill or a pension statement. Instead, he pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper with the Department of Defense letterhead embossed at the top. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. When you intercept a presidential communication and trigger a Viper protocol breach, paperwork is generated. The letter informed him that, due to the security incident involving a classified device, his top secret clearance, the golden ticket he needed for his cushy post-retirement consulting gig, was under immediate review and indefinite suspension. In the world of defense contracting, a suspended clearance is a professional death sentence. He wasn't just embarrassed anymore, he was unemployed. He stared at the paper, his face turning that same shade of gray I'd seen at the gala. He had spent years telling me that my job was fake, that I was playing games on computers. Now, the very system he claimed to worship had processed him out like a glitch in the code. My mother's reaction was swift and brutal, a masterclass in self-preservation. For years she had clung to Rick because he offered status, a connection to a world of rank and order that she admired. But a colonel who gets dressed down by the commander-in-chief? A consultant who loses his clearance and his income? That was a liability she couldn't afford. The breakup didn't happen with screaming or throwing vases, it happened with the cold, quiet efficiency of a business transaction. She told him it wasn't working, that the stress was too much, but we all knew the truth. She couldn't walk into the country club with the man who had become a punchline at the Pentagon. I watched him pack his bags, the old core duffel bag he loved to show off, and I felt a strange absence of malice. I didn't hate him, I didn't pity him. He was just a man who had forgotten that respect is currency, and he had overdrawn his account years ago. A week later, I was back where I belonged, standing in the center of the floor at USCYBERCOM. The air here was cool and smelled of ozone and filtered ventilation, a sharp contrast to the suffocating perfume of my mother's house. I swiped my badge, the green light blinking a welcome that felt more like home than the house I grew up in. My team was already moving, the wall of screens flickering with data streams from across the globe. There was no posturing here, no need to shout to be heard. Competence was the only language we spoke. My secure phone buzzed on the desk. I picked it up without a flinch, answering with a crisp, clear tone that required no modification for a fragile male ego. As I issued orders to a tactical team in the Pacific, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of a monitor. I looked tired, yes, but I looked solid. For so long, I had looked to my family for a reflection of my worth, only to see a distorted, diminished version of myself. But standing there, surrounded by the quiet hum of immense power, I finally accepted that I didn't need them to understand my work to value myself. Their blindness was not my defect. Time moves differently when you are building a legacy. 1 year later, I stood on a stage again, but this time it wasn't a gala. It was a promotion ceremony. The shoulder boards were changed, the thick gold stripe of a rear admiral replaced by the even heavier weight of a vice admiral. The applause was thunderous, coming from men and women who knew exactly what I had sacrificed to get there. Later that night, as I sat in my new office, the city lights of D.C. sprawling out below me like a circuit board, my personal cell phone pinged. It was a text from my mother. It was short, polite, and carefully constructed. "Happy birthday, Admiral. We saw the announcement in the paper. Hope you are well." I looked at the message for a long time. The old Elena, the one who craved their approval like oxygen, would have typed back instantly, eager to bridge the gap, to explain, to share. But the woman sitting in that chair simply smiled, a small private expression of peace. I didn't hate her. I didn't need to punish her. But I also didn't need to let her back in. The boundary was no longer a line in the sand, it was a fortified wall. I placed the phone face down on the desk, the screen going dark, and turned back to the classified report waiting for my signature. Rick spent his life demanding respect for the rank he used to hold. He never learned that true power doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it's just a quiet voice on the other end of the line. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your silence for weakness, hit that like button and tell your story in the comments. Dismissed?